am I wrong to also think that you have a Michigan connection? Is that right?
That's more than just right. Yeah, I was born in Detroit and grew up in the Detroit and Metro Detroit area, till I was 17. And then I fled to Ann Arbor and never looked back. So yeah, I do have the Michigan connection.
Okay, then half of my family would be very embarrassed if I didn't say "Go Blue" to you. My dad,
Oh,
they're all for
yeah.
Dearborn, and
Yes.
then he fled to Ann Arbor.
Yeah, well, we have a lot. There's a lot of connections here. Yeah, I'm appreciative that you said "Go Blue" because it's been over 20 years, so it's good to have a little a little national championship in the background. But that's part of who I am and part of my history is kind of growing up in. And people say this all the time, like, "Oh, you grew up in the Midwest." Well, yeah, geographically, but when you grow up in Detroit or Dearborn area, it's not culturally like the Midwest.
Right.
It's pretty complicated. It's a little more complicated than saying you grew up in the Midwest. So it was definitely a big influence.
Yeah, no, I'm from right outside Chicago. So
Oh,
yeah, from Evanston.
great little town.
Yes,
Great little town.
Another little college town that is sort of in the Midwest and yet also in its own kind of space.
I haven't been back to Dearborn since, well, I guess my grandmother died maybe 15 years ago, right? But we go there regularly, and it was like few other places in America, but like some other places where I've lived abroad, it felt like this layering of sort of histories. I mean, there's in a settler colonial country, there's tons of all sorts of that stuff, but like I'm thinking specifically about the way in which like I kept on feeling these kind of layerings of both resilience and also some kind of like these traumas, right? The way politics would kind of interface would come up in strange ways between my Irish family and like their memories, which were kind of fading into myth of experiences of intergenerational trauma and repression, and then combined with mobilization and advancement, and then just how they related to newly arrived Syrian and Palestinian refugees who were in many cases living in the exact same homes or, developments built where these previous folks had left. It just felt like this. It's a distinct milieu in this way. And you can, on the one hand, there were things of inspiration, but I also found myself feeling the pain there too.
Yeah, I think that's a very nuanced and right on analysis. I mean, there's something uniquely remarkable about that Detroit Dearborn generational kind of transitioning that so many communities have gone through. If you look at the wave of immigration from Europe that came to that space for various positions and in the automotive industry, my father actually ended up being part of a generation that came from Palestine, and our family's originally from New York, but then landed in the Detroit area specifically because of the promise of work. And my father did actually work at Ford for many years. He came as a child to the United States, but eventually, got a degree, worked at Ford. We had the whole kind of experience in that way. My grandparents lived in Dearborn. I had very similar experiences. And yet that layering that you spoke about and that kind of settler colonial kind of flavor and experience and I'd have to say the excavation, the psychological excavation that one has to go through growing up in that space with all of the history and all of the intensity and all of the movements from indigenous communities to European communities to Arab communities is really phenomenal and has had and continues to have kind of a profound influence. And I confess, I mean, when I go back, because my mother's still alive, she's still there. And when I go back, I have this kind of, and Freud talked about this, the return of the repressed, right? And I find this kind of really profound pull to go back. And when I mean go back, I want to go back to the original neighborhood where I was born and where I grew up, which is in Detroit proper. I want to see the vestiges of the burned out buildings from the 1960s and the riots in Detroit that have never been rebuilt, that have never to this day continue to be in ruins. It's like a Greco-Roman excavation because you're seeing this kind of history that has been untouched since the 60s. And then you can go into parts of Dearborn and Detroit. You see the elements of resilience, and I think resilience is a very complex term, and I'm very careful to use it. We can get into that at some point.
Yeah.
But you see elements of survival resilience,
Mm-hmm.
where you can go into parts of Dearborn and all the signage is in Arabic. You can go completely and function completely well without speaking or reading any English. You can get some of the best Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian, Iraqi, Yemeni, food on the planet there. And there's that sense of a sense of community with the flavor of like the Arab world, which you cannot find in too many other places outside of the Arab world. And in some ways, kind of ironically, when we think about globalization and the impact that it's happening in the Arab world, I find some sort of authenticity still in Dearborn that I don't even find in my travels to the Arab world. So it's that layering you talked about is very interesting, and that Irish and Polish kind of immigration experience, which is everywhere in the Detroit Dearborn area, and how those little homes in Dearborn and Detroit kind of passed on to this other generation of Arab immigrants is pretty remarkable. And of course, we can't forget, and because this is the big thing that is not being spoken, and this is really what, for me, another element that makes Detroit and Dearborn, that part of the world, so amazing, is that because of the Black experience in Detroit, which is a uniquely and profoundly interesting African-American community in the Detroit area. And you had, when you grew up in Detroit, we joked about this. Is it really the Midwest? But it's pretty complicated because you have the influence of the African-American communities there that brought with them that sense of growing up in the South, slavery, obviously, the Underground Railroad making its way up through into Detroit, and a profound and deep presence of the African-American community, the birth of Motown. Was a remarkable part, at least for me, of my experience growing up, having all of these profound influences from the vestiges of the European immigration, the African-American experience, the Arab migration. And by the way, as long as we're talking about settler colonialism, the indigenous communities in the Detroit area, and that history is pretty deep too, and there are lots of ghosts. Yeah, lots of ghosts there too.
Maybe it's just because I've been teaching. It's the second to last week of classes, and so I've been finishing off my Marx, Nietzsche, Freud seminar. So we're in late Freud right now, and we're just finishing Civilization and its discontents. But the image that you and Patrick are painting here of Detroit here is so similar to the beginning, to what Freud is doing with Rome.
Yeah.
And the sort of impossible layering of Rome from its many eras, and the idea that although physically so much is gone, nothing is destroyed in psychic life. There's a tendency to persist.
Yeah, I think that's so right on. I like the analogy to the Roman ruins, because if you go to parts of Detroit, you see the ruins.
Yeah.
You literally see the ruins. And then, in terms of the psychic ruins, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
And you have to negotiate and navigate that all the time there. And whatever community you're centered in, it's a really complex thing. Yeah. And I come back to this where and I know I could talk about this. We could probably talk about this forever. That concept of resilience.
Yeah.
I have a complex relationship to that word and how it gets used.
We do too. We actually just did a Against Resilience episode with Jason Connery.
Right. And I've given that. Given that lecture many times myself.
Mm-hmm.
As we think about like the places that we've come from and the places that our families have come from, and sort of keep rolling back the clock in this way, and detecting, well, like the ruins of an archaeological site, or like one of those, the tells, right? Those built up cities with many different layers of fire that between them that litter the Middle East. There is this kind of sense of simultaneity and of layering in time, of overlapping singular and incommensurate, but still motive and connected experiences of dispossession, of a yearning for home, of an attempting to survive in some way, of producing symptoms that may be harmful, but that are still in their own way better than the alternative of being crushed, of positive modes of solidarity, of many different things. And I guess with those themes, which, obviously ramify stateside in so many different ways, and with these themes too of Freud on the table, who's always talking about garrisoning cities and who will use phrases like, the occupation of the mind, where repression is forces occupying a town and all that. I found myself just reading over all your work about Gaza in particular and finding it harder to imagine a physical space more intensely saturated with those kinds of histories and more densely populated just in the here and now in raw numerical terms, with all the overdetermined symptoms and expressions of suffering and modes of resilience or modes of survival that entails. That's singular almost. It certainly feels like it's no other place I've never been there that I can imagine, and that's why I'm so glad that you're here for us to talk to about this.
Listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am really pleased to introduce Dr. Jess Ghannam, who is a Palestinian psychoanalyst and psychologist and clinical professor of psychiatry and global health sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. His research areas include evaluating the long-term health consequences of war on displaced communities and the psychological and psychiatric effects of armed conflict on children. Dr. Ghannam has developed community health clinics in the Middle East that focus on developing community-based treatments for families in crisis. He's also a consultant with the Center for Constitutional Rights, Reprieve, and other international NGOs that work with torture survivors. Locally, he works to promote and enhance the health and wellness of refugee, displaced, and immigrant populations from the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, and has established community-based mental health treatment programs to support these communities. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, it's truly my pleasure, and really thank you for that very generous introduction. It always sounds so much better than reality. So thank you for that.
That's that tragic difference between the first and third person perspective, right?
Right. Which we'll probably talk about at some point.
So let's get into it. Reading your work. So Patrick and I have been immersed in your work for the last week or so. And also our drawing, I should say, for our listeners on a recent talk you gave at the Green Clinic. But we found ourselves really staggered by the many ways in which you approach and break down experiences of suffering as overdetermined problems of time and space. And this is particularly salient in your thinking about Gaza, where you simultaneously address dimensions like the role of geography, how checkpoints structure everyday life, and in your considerations of how intergenerational trauma affects families and communities at scale. But we also saw this in your research on refugees in the Shatila refugee camp in Lebanon, on inhabitants of slums in Mumbai, and more. And we were likewise really struck by how your work involves both empirical studies in public health and this fundamentally psychoanalytic orientation to the lived texture of human experiences and their symptoms as meaningful expressions of pain. which brings you to ask questions like, where in places like this does the post-traumatic stress disorder begin? And when we get to talking about recent events, we'll be sure to see these as part of an ongoing and deeper history. But all of this is a long preface by way of saying that you bring so many things to the table. And so we're probably going to jump around a bit. But we'd like to start with a question that we ask all of our guests, namely, can you tell us a little bit about your background and about what brought you to psychoanalysis?
Oh, wow. That could take up the entirety of the podcast. That's a really good question. How I came to psychoanalysis, I would probably turn it upside down and say, actually, psychoanalysis came to me. And I mean that in a sense because, and I think about like how psychoanalysis found me was really based on kind of, for me at least, like this fundamental, enduring, unremitting kind of curiosity. And that curiosity, being about how does the world work? How do people work? And a fundamental, and this part of it is just kind of for my own kind of experience, kind of developmentally and growing up in this complex space and time in Detroit. I was just a voracious kind of reader and person interested in trying to understand the world and deeply, deeply curious. And I've kind of traversed and kind of intersected with so many different kinds of spaces and theories and my attempt to kind of make sense of the senseless, And so I mean, I first got exposed to psychoanalytic theory in high school. And I remember reading in high school The Interpretation of Dreams and being absolutely blown away by it. I mean, this was really mind-boggling to me, even as a 16-year-old, 15 or 16-year-old, trying to understand, like the mind is not logical and there's all these influences that we're not even aware of that influence how our mind is, what we think and what we dream. That was truly mind-boggling. And then from that kind of a trajectory into this vast expanse of just different, spaces from my intellectual foundational poles are just primarily, three people. It's like Darwin, Einstein, and Freud, right? I mean, and for me, that because primarily they were such disruptors in terms of like disrupting kind of a state or kind of understanding of things, and I'm kind of drawn to that. And then kind of going into just being, I studied biology and philosophy and psychology and art history and, evolutionary biology. I mean, all these things were kind of rattling around in my head. And Freudian theory, specifically early Freudian theory, is just something that was so compelling and in some ways so revolutionary. There's that famous Malcolm X quote, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us." Yeah. And I feel I would say the same thing about Freud. I didn't land on psychoanalytic theory. It landed on me. And when it landed, it was profound. And that's how I got into, how psychoanalysis found me, and I found it. And it's been a relationship ever since. And I just, from that, I've just been deeply fortunate to have a lot of amazing psychoanalytic mentors. And then from that, kind of my life took so many different directions. And, you rightly point out in the introduction, I do a lot of different things. I've got a lot of different interests, but I tell my students and my supervisees this every day, which is, I carry my psychoanalytic suitcase wherever I go. I mean, whether I'm in the Shatila refugee camp, whether I'm in Gaza, whether I'm in, Bayview, Hunters Point, whether I'm in, Detroit or East Oakland, it doesn't really matter. It's like this thing that is with me in terms of orienting me and helping me ground these really big questions about human existence. And then, on the one, then you go way over to the other side in terms of cosmological existence and, and then on the other side, all the way to Darwin in terms of genes and expression and evolutionary biology. And like, it's all circling around, but in the middle at its core is like, wow, psychoanalytic theory, specific kind of psychoanalytic theory, by the way, prior to 1919, is kind of my bedrock. It's like the thing that helps orient me. And it came to me early on in my life, and it's kind of stayed with me ever since. And it's rather amazing. And I feel like I can, it's so a part of me. It's wherever I go, whatever I do, that I feel like, wow, this is truly a disruptive, revolutionary kind of theory. Why aren't more people kind of really taking a hard look at this? I'm always asking that question.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a Palestinian psychoanalyst specifically, and what you've experienced in the field, especially since 9/11? Of course, I have in mind the paper that you wrote in response.
Well, listen, think about this. When I was coming up, getting psychoanalytic training, there was not even a space or a narrative about Palestine or about Palestinians. So to say that I didn't exist in terms of my identity within the psychoanalytic world is profound understatement. I mean, of course, I was the only Palestinian who was in psychoanalytic training that I was aware of, and I looked everywhere. And even at that time, again, early on, it was primarily kind of a white, kind of upper class kind of thing that privileged people engaged in. And it was, to say it kind of with understatement, deeply uncomfortable, deeply had the experience of not fitting in, deeply felt invisible in terms of my Palestinian identity, yet at the same time, so profoundly kind of engaged intellectually and emotionally with the training and the theory and its ability, the theory, to help me kind of make sense of things. I kind of, it would be probably overstatement to say I made the deal with the devil. I just did it, even though I feel like it cost me kind of psychically and emotionally to be so invisible.
Yeah.
And so, we use the word now alignment, like, because again, I mean, back in the day, as we say, if I said I was Palestinian, people would look at me like I had green slime on my face. It's like, what is that, man? And then, these different categories would be collapsed. Oh, you're from Pakistan? No, Palestine. Oh, so you're an Arab. What, well, so it's only been recently, within, recent time, that, there's a unique, specific narrative that we say Palestine, Palestinian, and people can say they're Palestinian, and we now have the narrative and the historical understanding to kind of know it. So that first part that I told you about, that's before 9/11, right? The 9/11 occurrence. Then 9/11 happens, and the shit hits the fan. If you're an Arab, if you're a Palestinian, the shit hits the fan, because the racism, the Islamophobia, the anti-Palestinian racism, the anti-Arab racism just kind of takes off like wildfire. And what we're seeing now, there's a lot of vestiges of that now, obviously after October 7th, but after 9/11, it was like a raging fire. And so I would be in these psychoanalytic spaces, and I would hear really smart people, really thoughtful people who had, some liberal, I won't say progressive, but at least liberal ideology about the world, say the craziest, racist, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian things. Like, why do Arabs want to kill their children? Why do they force us to kill their children? I mean, really flagrantly, like crazy, racist, horrible things, dehumanizing, delegitimizing things. And so my ability, again, to be in alignment, to kind of be the kind of person and professional and be the kind of analyst I wanted to be, was, to say the least, really challenging. And I did what I always did, and I do this to this day. You kind of, and this is why the title of your podcast is so awesome. You have to deal with the ordinary unhappiness about things not being the way exactly you want it, and then you make peace with that, and you kind of do what you can do, which I'm very thankful to Sigmund Freud and to psychoanalytic theory for that deep kind of understanding of the human condition. But, after 9/11, it was rough, to say the least. And for many years, for a decade and a half afterwards, psychoanalytic theory produced this kind of literature that was deeply racist, deeply anti-Arab, deeply anti-Palestinian. You referenced the article that I wrote called Psychoanalysis in the Service of Imperialism, and really kind of call out to people, to practitioners who use psychoanalytic theory to bludgeon certain communities, to bludgeon brown people or Black folks or Palestinians or anybody who wasn't white. And, the field paid a price. The field has been deeply reactionary, in my humble opinion, deeply reactionary for forever. And is only now, I would say, within the last 5 years or so, slowly coming out of its reactionary slumber and waking up and opening up a little bit, and not without it kicking and screaming, because I'm privy to all of these e-lists, and people on psychoanalytic listservs are talking about what's happening in Palestine and Israel right now. And I feel like, again, Return of the Repressed, I'm being re-triggered, re-traumatized, because I'm seeing people write the most horrific, racist, dehumanizing things that one could even imagine about Palestinians. So, the return of it comes back, right?
Yeah.
Because certain things are not managed or processed or engaged with psychically, the repressed always comes back. So, things are, that's the short answer, by the way. And I'm sorry for kind of going on that. But, the thing that I find really amazing now is that I now have colleagues who are Palestinian, who are psychoanalysts, or who want to become psychoanalysts. I now see the diversity of kind of the communities within the psychoanalytic community emerging, and it's a breath of fresh air. But it's making a lot of people uncomfortable, and it's good. It's good. I mean, just, oh my, I could talk forever about this word uncomfortable, right? We all could. And it's so much part of what's wrong, and the difficulties and the challenges we have in the world have to do with that word, uncomfortable, right? Because, and this is really how I think about doing the work, which is so different, from the way we train people, is that it's all about discomfort, man.
Yeah.
Discomfort is my compass. That's what I do. If I'm clinically, if I'm with a patient and I'm working with somebody, what's my compass point?
Yeah.
It's discomfort. Right?
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. So let's talk a little bit about your work in Palestine. And I know we want to get to your experiences teaching Freud in Gaza and your interventions in the Gaza Community Health Program. But before we do that, I want to ask, what first led you there? What did you expect to find? What did you encounter? And I wanted, one of the things I want our listeners to be able to hear is a bit about, in particular, some of your empirical findings about the state of mental health care and the landscape of mental health distress in Gaza. Because the rates of PTSD and other disorders that you talk about, and the inaccessibility of treatment. I mean, the data that you're presenting is just it's really stunning.
What brought me to Palestine is part of my own personal kind of archaeology and excavation. I mean, I'm born of Palestinian refugees, grew up in an extended Palestinian family, hearing stories of life in Palestine before Israel even existed. You know, it's not that long ago. Israel didn't even exist before 1948. And so my grandparents and my parents, even though they were born before 1948, you know, they were relatively young at the time. And just hearing these awesome stories about what Palestine was like in terms of this multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious, you know, space, unlike anything else in the world, by the way, at the time, in terms of like coexistence of like, you know, Christians, Muslims, and Jewish community, atheists, Buddha. I mean, it was really an extraordinary place, not without its difficulties, obviously, but it was diverse in ways that we never saw, and even to this day don't even see, you know? So I think part of, you know, hearing those stories and then growing up and that being part of my identity, I had to see for myself, right? And so it was happening right around the time where, you know, not to go too much into the political history, but it was difficult to go to Palestine prior to to say the least, especially for Palestinian, before the Oslo agreements. So the Oslo agreements, you know, kind of materialized in 1993. And so after that, things became a little easier to travel and to go to Palestine. And then I had been doing a lot of analytic work at that time. I'd been doing research on trauma and trying to think critically and carefully about trauma, and thinking about, because this is just my global perspective, about, you know, critically thinking about Western concepts of anything, let alone about mental health and psychiatry and psychology, and how to think critically about that and going and working globally. So I said, well, yeah, I'm going to go. So I started going in the mid 1990s, and, you know, have been going back and forth consistently ever since. What I saw, what I had to bear witness to, especially for children in Gaza, and the manifestation of the settler colonial project, of the occupation of Palestine, and the matrix of control and its impact on Palestinians in Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, and even the Palestinian citizens of Israel really, really blew me away. It just was it gave me a window. And again, with my psychoanalytic suitcase, right? It blew me away in terms of the breadth and the depth of trauma, the impact on psychic life. It was, you know, it was transformative, to say the least, and painful. You know, painful in ways that I carry to this day. I mean, there's a kind of pain and grief, magnified obviously by what's happening today, that is just enormous. And because you're seeing the impact of this generational trauma, multi-generational trauma, transgenerational trauma on Palestinian children now, unlike anything else we see anywhere in the world. And so, like, and this is the 1990s, and after 9/11, you know, early on, and I put this in air quotes, when things weren't as bad. I mean, relatively speaking, you know, there wasn't a genocide. There was a form of genocide. It was a slow, creeping kind of ethnic cleansing and genocide, but it wasn't the kind of mass scale of genocide that we see today. And then when we looked at Palestinian children, for example, we found empirically, when we looked at this, that, and again, this is from the 1990s, this is, you know, after right around the time of the first Intifada, that Palestinian children 80% of Palestinian children in Gaza had some symptoms of PTSD. Now, 80% of children having some symptoms of PTSD. Now, just so that our listeners kind of can understand this, when you look at symptoms of PTSD and quote, regular, I don't want to say normal, but just like, if you randomly sample children, anywhere in the world, maybe children, you'll inevitably find way under 10% of children will have some symptoms of PTSD, right? So, but Palestinian children, 80% of them having some symptoms, nightmares, bedwetting, anxiety, was truly remarkable. And when we compared it to like children from Iraq or children from Afghanistan or children from sub-Saharan Africa or children who had experienced, significant, either mass casualty events or mass climate disasters, it wasn't even close. So I was really, burdened by like, okay, this trauma burden is profound. We have to dig deeper. And the digging deeper just led me to a number of different things. It led me to want to obviously think about how do we think about intervening at this level? What role does psychoanalytic theory or psychoanalysis play in a space that is deeply occupied and under militarized occupation? Is there room to teach it? Is there room to kind of engage and use it kind of clinically? And how can we use it to help us better understand the breadth and the depth of the trauma that these children are experiencing? And then that led to everything, afterwards. So that's kind of the foundational element. And, kind of going fast forward and thinking about where my thinking is today and everything that has happened since, I'll just say that when you put into context what's happening to Palestinian children today, and you look back to 1948 or 1947, because from 1947 to 1949, 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed and forcibly removed from their homes and villages. 500 villages were depopulated. We can't even say by Israel because Israel didn't exist at the time, but what they were Jewish militia groups like the Stern Gang and the Haganah, and they were paving the way for the European settler colonial project that swept Palestine from 1947 to 1949. That trauma from 47 to 49 and the transition from that settler colonial process, which has morphed into occupation, which has morphed into apartheid, which is now going into genocide, all logically connected, has resulted in a kind of trauma for Palestinians and specifically for Palestinian children, unlike anything that any children anywhere else in the world have experienced. There's just no comparison, not even close, because we're talking about 75 years of uninterrupted trauma inherited from generation to generation, from family to family. So it made me rethink the whole concept of trauma. And I've said this so many times, especially recently, for Palestinians, especially Palestinian children, there's no post. There was never an end to the trauma. When we teach PTSD, you have a traumatic event, it stops, it's discrete. You may or may not develop symptoms, they may or may not resolve. That's how we treat it. They don't resolve, you do a treatment. But what do you do with structural violence? What do you do with structural racism? What do you do about structural oppression on a community or communities, whether it's Palestinians or African Americans or LGBTQ plus communities, which have the pressure of a systemic and systematic kind of oppression that never stops? It forced me to completely rethink what trauma is, how we engage with it, its impact, how symptoms develop, and then obviously how to intervene. So, and again, that's the if you can believe it, that's kind of the short version. But that kind of gives you a little bit of the flavor of, why we have to, as analysts and as public health providers and as human beings of the world and concerned citizens of the world, have to completely rethink what trauma is and then how to intervene. You can't just drop cognitive behavioral therapy or Prozac, on large communities who've experienced this structural violence for such a long time and this kind of trauma and expect the trauma to be mitigated or to be better. It's much more complicated.
I want to just underscore the point that you're making and this through line throughout your work for listeners who may have heard the phrase intergenerational trauma sort of invoked in a way that is glib or that seems to be sort of mystically sort of woo in some way, right? In the idea that something is vibing with me here. I don't feel comfortable with this, right? I don't know. People in my family will make bad jokes about potatoes or something, right? That's how I got out of eating them for a period of time. No offense to any Irish people, right? But so that's sort of a cultural meme, right? But what you're talking about here, and what I think is really vital to understand, and it sort of beggars the imagination in two dimensions. One, because it's world historical, right? We're talking about migrations and displacements and events that have been with geopolitical importance and that have involved things like, well, I can think of settlements being raised and then hospitals and prisons being built on top of where those settlements were, and then people get mental health treatment in those settlements, right? It's that type of stuff.
Yeah.
But also and this is the connection that one of the connections that I've come across with to your work from elsewhere in some of the research I do on gun violence in domestic U.S. context and on sort of the history of psychoanalysis and the thinking of counterinsurgency, right? It is the way in which it's not just abstraction when what we're dealing with in communities where violence is concentrated in these ways by state forces, independent of the timelines of longer term family experiences or what the epigenetic vectors are. It's empirical stuff like you document. I mean, I think it's the Khan Yunis study that nearly 50% of kids have seen a friend of theirs violently killed, right? Something like 20% of them have witnessed the killing of a family member. Something like another 10% have witnessed their home being destroyed, right? These are, I don't know, I found myself looking back to similar public health research that happened statesides, right? And some of the most quote unquote compelling evidence that I can find, and this says a lot about our national priorities or even what we're willing to conceive of about as traumas and the beginning and end dates for when we can be attuned to or care for them, I guess, is stuff that's if there's a shooting in an inner city school in the US, this will be the equivalent of 1 week's lost classes for the students involved, and that will correlate with, on average, many lower points on the SAT, right? And as though you can sort of amortize this, and critics will rightly be like, well, in a place where there's a body dropping every week, that you'll rapidly wind up losing more weeks of school than there are weeks to have it. But then to think about that in this context, and particularly in the way in which discussions, misguided or otherwise, can sort of derail on invoking a particular date as when to begin the narrative, as though there were no traumas prior to it. There's these. I guess what I'm trying to say, and both appreciating your work and trying to bring people on board to processing sort of the difficulty of thinking is both huge and granular and brutal at scale, is that it's hard to even imagine. I think it's hard to even think about, and that pressure, that discomfort, I guess, that feeling of being uncomfortable with that is enough to make a person want to disavow it, to shoot the messenger, or to just shut down in some way.
Yeah. There's so much in your question, so many different ways that we can go with that. But I think let me just say a little bit about that. The stats that you spoke about in our study. That's way before October 7th. That's even before, if you can believe it, parts of it were. Gaza has been through 5 brutal wars since 2005, and a complete blockade and shutdown. You can't go in. Nothing goes in and out of Gaza without Israeli control. Everything gets controlled. So the fact that many children prior to October 7th and before the totality of the 5 wars experience witnessing the death of a loved one, witnessed a home demolition is truly extraordinary. And as I said before, it's unlike anything we see anywhere else. And one of the things that's really important about this, and because I'm sure some people are saying, well, what about Syrian refugees? What about Iraqi refugees? What about all these other displaced communities? Well, the difference is that in every single setting, everywhere else in the world, if your community or your family comes under attack, you have the ability to leave. You can physically remove yourself from the immediacy of the danger, and albeit treacherous, let's say if you're a Syrian refugee and you're trying to go from Syria somewhere else, at least you can leave, whether it's to Europe or whether it's to North Africa. I mean, wherever you can leave. The problem for Palestinians from 1948 on, and especially for Palestinians in Gaza, there's no place to go. The violence is unremitting. The violence is systemic and systematic. And if you look at those statistics now, how many children have witnessed the death of a loved one? It's probably in the 90% now. There isn't a single child in Gaza who hasn't had to bear witness to the death of a family member, a parent, or an extended family member. It's a kind of violence. It's a kind of traumatic exposure that is just unlike anything. With that being said, your other point, which is really, really key here, who decides when to start the traumatic, date, right? Do we say PTSD starts with, in the Palestinian context, when does it start? Does it start October 7th? Does it start with the war in 2014, 2012, 2008 or 9, 2005? Or does it go back to 1947 with that initial kind of wave of ethnic cleansing? And it's pretty clear in terms of the research and thinking about this and speaking and interviewing hundreds, if not thousands of people over the decades, that when you excavate this a little bit, when you just scratch below the surface, when you just engage in a respectful way in which where people are not dehumanized or delegitimized and kind of acknowledged, you have children who will tell you, and this is true, and I've seen this in the refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, although they don't exist in Syria anymore, in Jordan and in West Bank and in Gaza. If you ask an 8-year-old child today in Gaza, where are you from? Where's your family from? They never tell you the city that they're currently living in. They will tell you the city that their great-grandparent was dislocated from in 1948. 4 generations ago, that weighs heavy on their psychic life. Still. So in thinking about in the Palestinian context and kind of framing and understanding and kind of, because what I'm advocating is a complete rethinking of the notion of trauma.
Yes.
In terms of structural violence, structural racism, structural oppression. If we look at it that way, in a more comprehensive way, with the Palestinian example as kind of a model for kind of expanding our understanding, then you can see that the trauma has never stopped. It's been continuous for 75 years. And then if I think about it in the African-American context, well, it's been continuous for 400 years, right?
Yeah.
You look at the effects of the transatlantic slave trade and what happened, for 400 years of dispossession and structural violence. And what about indigenous communities in the Americas? We would make the same argument. So ironically, my research on understanding trauma in the Palestinian context is going to free up and expand our knowledge of trauma for all these other communities where structural violence has been endemic and, I might add, has never stopped.
One of the most powerful parts of your talk for the Green Clinic, certainly for me, and I think for many other listeners, comes when you're talking about child's play, where you can really see, just in these ways that are staggering, the sort of intersection between state repression and psychic trauma. So I was hoping you could tell our listeners a little bit about those forms of play, what you're seeing, how you interpret them as you're carrying your psychoanalytic suitcase, as it were, with you.
Okay. Y'all need to get your seatbelts on. So this is somewhat, I'm going to condense a really long story, which is, I guess, I've been saying that a lot during our discussion today. So sorry about that. So like, by way of context, let me just say that, and this is where my exposure to evolutionary biology really is like deeply impactful. Because if you look at human beings transculturally, this is true just for every human culture, every human community, indigenous or otherwise. We know something fundamental that happens, and that is children play. And that playing becomes a fundamental aspect of cognitive, emotional, and motor development. We see it in the animal kingdom. We see it among mammals. It's an extraordinary aspect of any species. Offspring engage with their parents, right? It just, we see it with lion cubs, you see it with various species of monkeys, you see it, you just see it everywhere, right? So we know that play is fundamental to development. And when I was first going to Palestine and seeing children play, I was really struck by this game that they played. And it's a version of like cops and robbers, right?
Yeah.
And this was early on in like the 90s before things, started to really escalate. And, Palestinian kids would play this game, freedom fighter would be the heroic agent in this cinematic display. And the bad guy might be a settler or an Israeli, military person. And you'd have the heroic freedom fighter defending the family and overcoming and being victorious over the occupier or the military. That would be, an essential aspect of play. Fast forward into the 2000s, the occupation, the systematic violence, the kind of evolution of settler colonialism, occupation into apartheid, into further ethnic cleansing, and Palestinian children being exposed to like significant violence by the Israeli military in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, everywhere. I was blown away by the change in the play of Palestinian children. So what I was seeing, instead of this thing where Palestinian children would want to play the freedom fighter or the liberator, they changed and they identified with the anti-hero. They started to identify with the Israeli soldier. Oh, I was just like, whoa. That's, as we say here in the Bay, that was hella interesting to me, just as a psychoanalyst, right? Just as someone who's interested, not to mention like really, just personally really difficult and painful to see. And then if you just unpack it just a little bit, and this is really the crux of the story here, like why do Palestinian children then identify with an anti-hero, right? You notice that in the 1990s, after the first Intifada, the Israeli military would do something systematically and systemically every time they would go into a Palestinian home, because they were notorious. I shouldn't use the past tense. They are notorious for doing night raids in families. And the structure of the night raid goes something like this. It's 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning. Families are asleep. The Israeli military comes into your home. They wake everybody up. They put the children and the women in one part of the room. They take the father, they disrobe him to his underwear. They make him get on his knees, and they psychically castrate and humiliate the father in front of the children And they will do that for hours and hours and hours. And they do it time and time and time again. So people talk about like the occupation and the settler colonial project in its physical dimensions. I really think it's a psychic. The psychic element of the settler colonial project is much more powerful, intense, and damaging, because what the Israeli government was doing through its state-sponsored use of its military was essentially creating the psychic thing for Palestinian children, that your father is unable to protect you, that your father is castrated, that your father cannot have any agency. I heard this story thousands of times from people, from children who said they had to bear witness to their fathers being humiliated in this way. The impact on the children had a direct impact on the play that they would engage in, right? So they were now identifying with the antiheroes. For Palestinian men, it had a profound impact because they had to go through this process of being so deeply humiliated and castrated in front of their families. Now, it gets even worse, if you can believe this, because things in Gaza got so profoundly worse after 2005, when the Israeli military enacted its total blockade, and you had through 5 wars. The children stopped playing. The trauma was so deep and so intense and so unremitting that the capacity and the ability to play was severely curtailed. Fast forward. So then me thinking about, well, how do we intervene? Am I going to bring a kid in and do play therapy when there's only one psychiatrist for 1.5 million Palestinians? No. Are we going to administer medications? No. What we're going to do, and what I thought, is that we have to create spaces for children where they can come and be children, so that they can play, so that they can engage in play in a therapeutic space. And so we did that. We created these therapeutic playgrounds. It was massively successful because you saw this transformation of kids being isolated, having all these trauma symptoms, not being able to play, being fearful, and then coming into these therapeutic playgrounds and being able to engage with one another in ways that is both psychically and, I would say, evolutionarily kind of so essential. This is the brief version again, if you can believe it. But this was informed by my psychoanalytic understanding of psychic life, the importance of play in psychic life, the importance of maneuvering in space with other people, with other human beings. And the other thing that we did along those lines, by the way, is we would bring the parents in and kind of do psychoeducational things so that we could, re-empower the parents to stay connected to each other and to their children. It was wildly successful. And, I'm sorry to say that after October 7th, obviously, they've all been destroyed. But that gives you a sense of like structural violence and the psychic element of structural violence and how and we see this. I mean, it's not like we don't see this in the African American community today with what's happening to Black men. We've seen it for generations in indigenous communities, in terms of what's happened to, what structural and state violence does to men. All I'm saying is that, the impact on children when you perceive your father or the paternal object as being incapable of protecting you and being castrated psychically in that way, it has a devastating impact on psychic life for children. And that's one of the things that, I'm quite concerned about, obviously, going forward.
I do think that episode and that analysis, since you first related it, has just been, it keeps hitting me over and over again in different ways. And I think one thing it does is it definitely opens up vectors of analogy to other situations of repression in the blunt state sense, right? And I think about how, one feature of like stop and frisk policing in the US, right? I think we could read that that's a type of sexualized dominance. Like a whole bunch of cops throw a lot of young black men up against the wall and make them drop trow as people drive by.
Exactly.
Or I think about, and this is related to what we were talking about earlier in terms of these sort of invocations of traumas either in the past or as having a certain sort of timeline in order to push away ongoing traumas or deeper timelines that might implicate us. I keep thinking about a lot of the anti-immigration discourse in the US, right? Where it's like, oh, here are all these young Latin American kids are coming from places where the state has been captured by like Mara's MS-13 or whatever. These kids are absolutely terrible. And somehow we need to harden our borders, oftentimes with invocation of a direct Israeli model behind that. And then the moment we start thinking about, well, what actually happened to the family structures in these countries?
Exactly.
Were there revolutions there? Were we involved in that? But no, it's just the consequence is merely that these people are always inevitably bestial. And much in the same way too, is like one can simultaneously blame quote unquote all American blacks for like quote unquote inherent criminality and a supposed failure of patriarchal authority without at any point ever mentioning that, black men are disproportionately in mechanisms of carceral control that hurt their families and that hurt them. So it's this interesting combination of like allowing the harm to be perpetuated or allowing a past harm to bear fruition in present, like nightmarish pain, and then be like, oh, this is proof that this was good all along, and it's their fault to begin with. These sort of doubling downs in a way.
Yeah.
I guess like the thing I wanted to also connect here too, though, that made me think about, it's like just an intertext that popped into my mind as you related this. I found myself going back to that famous bit in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, where he sort of polemically says the colonized child has no Oedipus complex. There is no Oedipus complex in Martinique, right? And I think we could historicize this in terms of, well, yeah, probably there isn't an Oedipal triangle if your mother can be sold, right? Or if there's the slave master or the driver intercedes into that, right? But where Fanon goes with this too, and what I found myself again directly, hauntingly connecting with your example was his experiences of like going to the movies as a child in Martinique, and all these black francophone kids identify with the hero who is, Tintin or the white guy killing black kids, killing like savage, quote unquote, savage black like tribes people. And in that sense, it's like prior to this type of determination that we would call the Oedipus complex, which is tethered to the Oedipal family, we have an alienation, right? A self-alienation that's being imposed through media, but also through concrete operations of power. And one of the outcomes of that, and this is, I think, that devious rapprochement between the political economic and the libidinal economic, right, is that actually works to undo the family as a site of political resistance and safety for a population.
Yeah. It's 100%.
It's like trying 100%. To actually lacerate the social capillaries of the basic units of where people can find some degree of safety, and at every possible level, making it worse. And so it does follow that, well, you're not going to play in this way that seems like fairly quote unquote normal, and instead you're going to identify with the aggressor. And then after that, you're not even going to want to play anymore at all. And if you do, well, there go the playgrounds.
Right. Yeah, I think that's spot on. Yeah. And it, just to kind of riff a little bit on what you said, I mean, well, isn't our carceral system of black men exactly a manifestation of what I just described in Palestine with the Israeli military and their system of incarceration of Palestinian men? It's the same thing. It's like that system of dehumanizing, delegitimizing, and castrating men, and then fragmenting families. And that form, which I think is the most vicious form of state-sponsored violence. I mean, I understand that the physical manifestations are horrific. And don't get me wrong, because, if you're a Palestinian or you're a black man and you come up against the Israeli military, you come up against, the police who are going to kind of physically, do grave bodily harm to you, that's a horrific form of oppression. But when you systematize and you display cinematically the system of oppression, I mean, it's one thing to arrest a Palestinian man in the middle of the night, take him out of his home, put him away, and then leave the children and the mother alone, right? But there's this whole cinematic enactment that is done deliberately, intentionally, with a particular kind of impact to create something that the Israelis believe will tell children and tell Palestinians resisting is futile. Now, that's failed, obviously, but it's really worth thinking about how those systems of violence and incarceration and the way in which it's used, and thinking about the Palestine context, and thinking about what this country, the United States, does to African Americans and men of color, to kind of the fragmentation of the family and what it does to young children. I mean, I think the similarities are more than just obvious, they're profound. Speaking of that kind of psychic state violence, I think is, I mean, we could talk, I know that we could talk forever about that, but then we have to go to the next step. Well, then what's the mitigation? What's the redress? How do we overcome that? And, the therapeutic playground is one small element of it, but ultimately there has to be, accountability and justice. That doesn't sound very psychoanalytic, by the way, right? In terms of an intervention, but it is in fact, because when I'm bringing Lacan and Freud and all of this stuff in, but in terms of like reestablishing the paternal function, reestablishing the law of the father, reestablishing integrity within the family of the maternal and the paternal functions and the law of the father is integral to the survival of communities that are being torn asunder by this state-sponsored violence in the carceral system, right? So, I mean, that's probably worth a whole other kind of multi-hour discussion, but, I think that's what makes the discussion about Palestine right now so important, because it serves as a model, if you will, to help us understand, like, well, these other forms of state-sponsored violence and repression and the impact on the fragmentation of the family and what it does to kids. It's like, I feel like I want to just scream about this at the top, scream at the top of my lungs on the top of a building. Like, don't you guys see what's going on?
In all these examples, the stuff about the carceral system in the States, the flows of migrants from places where we've done drug war, dirty shit, to the obvious sequelae of a situation like in Gaza, where I guess like the father isn't quote unquote disappeared, but he's like disappeared while remaining, right? His paternal function is removed, right? Is that
psychically disappeared? Yeah.
These are all, we don't necessarily know what's going to come from this, but like we could kind of logically say that the sequelae, barring interventions and, remarkable, and granted the fact that people can survive remarkable things and without being sort of corroded by them, we can still say that the outcomes are almost certainly going to be bad and they're going to be ugly. And yet there is this kind of posture of like not just shocked surprise, but like objectively like withdrawing to a position of abstract moralizing. That's like, it always seems to beg the question of, well, what did you expect? Right? It would be ludicrous not to expect that a brutalized population would lash out or would have internalized violence. Like, what would you expect that people who have the entire family system structure, like for multiple generations, right, entangled with vicious regimes of repression, get caught up in it again? And it's certain like that the repressive regime is they're already on their radar and they'll invoke that. And so there's something about that, like the disavowal,
disavowal
of what is obvious.
kind of appropriately, right? The unconscious doesn't know time, so we've been like moving around in time and space. But I want to bring us up to the present.
Yeah.
And just, to let our listeners know that we're recording this on April 26th, 2024, that the Israeli campaign into Gaza has yielded at minimum 35,000 dead, overwhelmingly civilians, of them overwhelmingly women and children. And, on this podcast, right, ordinary unhappiness is still the goal. So we don't really deal in punditry and prognostication or in making our guests perform hope or present us with solutions. We're really interested in sitting with and talking about difficult things in an earnest way. And yet immersing myself in your work, it's a brutal experience to read, both with the empirical and qualitative, toggling back between these two things. It builds this conception of trauma that you've been talking about, and it's crushing. It's crushing. And yet, listening to you talk at the Green Clinic and reading you carefully, there is still this appreciation, not of resilience in the sort of pat way that people like to talk about it, but there is this attunement to how symptoms themselves, these things that we're often trying to cure and resolve, but how these symptoms can present a kind of working through and represent a kind of survival instinct. And above all, and here I promise we never stray too far from Lacan, you're invoking over and over the idea of desire, both in terms of these harmful fantasies, right, that teach us to desire certain things, and also these treasured fantasies that, when they go unfulfilled, they leave us with this loss that often goes unmourned, and it transforms into violence instead. But you also have talked about desire in terms of how breaking the spell of these bad fantasies can open us up to desire for new things, to see new things being capable of existing, to be desired in the first place. And so, on that note, what would you desire for yourself, for the people of Gaza, for psychoanalysis? I told you it was going to be a big question.
Oh my, that is such an awesome question. It really, really is. And I wish we had hours and hours to talk about it. So look, I'm gonna go from like the kind of clinical up to the larger level, and like for me, one of the ways in which psychoanalytic theory is so deeply powerful, deeply powerful, is that when it's done well, instead of being attached to a single unconscious fantasy as the only way to have desire realized, you have opportunities to have multiple kinds of fantasies so that your desire can be realized in more complex, rich, at times painful, obviously, but at least you have a more complex repertoire of opportunities to have desire or desires realized. And you don't get narrowed or attached to a singular kind of cinematic way of having desire realized, right? So that's really, for me, ultimately the kind of superpower of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic treatment and psychoanalytic theory is that there's a freedom, ultimately, if it's done well, that you have this freedom to have desire realized in multiple ways, and are a little bit, you're freed up from that. So you can have the opportunity for ordinary unhappiness, which would be awesome for people to have. So with that being said, what I really am, my own desire, my own hopes, my own kind of thinking, my own kind of positionality and thinking about how I'm engaging with, the horrors of what's happening right now. I have a couple of things to say. One is for the psychoanalytic community in general, and one is for like the world community in general. from my colleagues and peers in the psychoanalytic community who have become psychically ossified in terms of understanding what is happening in Palestine, specifically in Gaza right now, who have become, there's no other way of talking about it other than kind of disavowal, and who are engaged in a kind of, attempt to not just dehumanize and delegitimize the Palestinians and the humanity of Palestinians, but to basically a psychic, if not physical, erasure of Palestinians in Palestine. My plea to them, to that kind of group, is that that's number one, it's not going to work. It's going to make things worse. You're doing a disservice not only to yourself, but to kind of the power and the awesomeness of psychoanalytic understanding of things. And it's a plea to kind of, make more room and space, because something really phenomenal will happen if Palestinians, not just for the psychoanalytic community, but for the world community, if you begin to see Palestinians and Palestinian children as human beings, as legitimate and entitled to the same kind of rights of any other human being, and entitled to the ability and the capacity to thrive and play and engage in the world like every other child in the world should have, that's going to help us get out of this mess. Because if there is a continuation of this disavowal, denial, and delegitimization and attempt to erase the Palestinians, it's like what we spoke about at the beginning. It's like, talk about the return of the repressed. It's like, physically erasing the Palestinians is not going to take away the ruins, the psychic ruins that the Israeli military and the Israeli government have laid waste to. It's like, that's the idea. It's so concretized. It's so kind of developmentally, primitive. It's so, this is where Klein really, Klein really comes in too, right? It's like this primitive theory is that if we just disavow or destroy the thing, it will go away.
Yeah.
We don't have to worry anymore. That's not how it works psychically. It's never worked. It will never work. It certainly will not work with Palestine. It's certainly not going to work with the issue of Palestine or with Palestinians or with Palestinian children. So it's like, we have to do what we would do. We have to make room. We have to make psychic space for thinking about things in a much richer, complex, nuanced way. And if we don't do that, then we're headed for something really, really horrific. If you can imagine that, as horrific as things are now, things can get worse. Now, your listeners may find this hard to believe, but I am really a hopeful guy. I really am. I know that sounds weird. I know it sounds weird to people after this kind of long exposition of state-sponsored violence in the carceral system. But the reason I remain kind of hopeful is by what I'm seeing globally in terms of global solidarity with Palestine, global solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, and a kind of opening up of this very space that is attempted to be crushed by the state or by power. We see spaces opening up for the first time in 75 years to talk about Palestine, to talk about state-sponsored terror, to talk about all of these things and all of these different spaces in the global marketplace of ideas that have never been possible before, or have only been open to select few. Now we're seeing kind of this global psychic uprising, if you will, of interest in and more spaces to think about Palestine. And from that standpoint, I am immensely, hopeful. Not that it's going to be easy, not that it won't be, profoundly difficult. It will be, but the space is now opened things are happening. We're talking on, April 26th, 200 college campuses have essentially either been shut down or have encampments demanding, an immediate ceasefire, and that the United States, not be complicit in the genocide anymore. And, it's like rather remarkable what we're seeing. This is a classic, talk about return of the repressed, right? This is the Vietnam era, return of the repressed coming up now in 2024 in the context of the war in Palestine. So, I think there's reason because there's more room psychically to think. And for me personally, I feel so much more alignment and the ability to maneuver psychically and physically in more spaces now that I've ever felt, in my life. So from that standpoint, I think there's kind of reason to have not false hope, but reason to be somewhat kind of hopeful that these spaces will continue to develop and open and create opportunities for engagement that we haven't had, in 75 years. At least that's kind of what I'm hoping for.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to talk with you today, Dr. Ghannam. We're so grateful for your making the time.
This is probably one of the most fun podcasts I've done or interviews that I've done because, how many times do you get a chance to talk about psychoanalytic theory in this way? It was just really great. I really appreciate you guys and doing this. And it was really a lot of fun for me, really.
Thank you so much for listening, everyone. This is the part where I remind you that if you enjoy listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, that is because this podcast is made possible entirely through the generous support of our Patreon community so that we do not have to shill for things we don't believe in, like, AI, mental health apps and whatnot. So if you would like to support the podcast and get 2 additional episodes per month of Ordinary Unhappiness, head on over to patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Jess Ghannam. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.